Let's see here. Yep, we are
Cool.
live. Perfect. All right, so welcome to another Full Circle Magic Q&A. I'll be your host and moderator today, Alex Morton, and today our guest, the awesome, the great Oliver Dobbs.
Hello to everybody. um, yeah, before we start anything, I'd like to say a big thank you to Full Circle Magic for giving me the opportunity to talk to people a little bit about the sort of things that I do.
Absolutely, man, and we thank you for being up and around. While we're getting viewership up and whatnot, we always like to have the guests start out with a quick how you got into magic, how you got to where you're at, and really what inspired you to take the path that you're on now.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the way I got into magic, I sort of had quite humble beginnings in it, and it's not the best in it. I actually started out watching a YouTube video of a particular card trick, which is completely lame, and it wasn't even a very good trick. But the idea that I just couldn't figure out how it was done, I had to go on to watch another video revealing the method, and from there I just started learning more and more things based off general internet stuff, getting whatever I could for free, and I sort of got into mainly card magic and that sort of stuff. Um, this was back when I was at school. So at the time, I used to go around performing little card tricks and all sorts of things for all of my friends, and generally got pretty good responses. But I always found the best thing, the thing that people always asked a bit more about, was mind reading and that sort of thing. So I thought, as a natural progression, since that what people were responding better to, that's what I'll go into. So then I started making the transition, getting more into mind reading and stuff like that. Um, the first mentalism book that I ever purchased was the 13 Steps, which is a pretty classic book to purchase. And from that, I sort of I used to do a lot of work with carbon paper and a lot of work with Swami gimmicks and all that sort of stuff. Generally building up the simpler techniques. But what I always found was a profound interest was that the simplest techniques can always be taken completely out of context. You can always add scripting to make them so much more powerful than they seem. It can get to the point where something as simple as guessing a three-digit number on a piece of paper can absolutely blow people away. And I was always shocked at how striking them. So yeah, I kind of got more into scripting from that sort of thing, and I think really the turning point was me when I read Derren Brown's Absolute Magic. That completely changed the way that I thought about scripting, and it opened me up to the idea that I needed to think more about what it was that I was doing. So from that, I started sort of adapting and developing theories of my own to sort of incorporate into my scripts. And after reading Derren Brown's book, I started reading stuff about Richard Osterling, them sorts of people. And from there, I naturally got into scripting my effects in a way that I'd never really done before.
Absolutely, man. And you, something you said to me when we were talking in private was you actually script for other people now too, don't you?
Absolutely, yeah. This is something that I've had open to FCM members for a long time, and something I've opened to BIMP members as well. It's essentially the idea is I think a lot of people who are just beginning in magic or mentalism or whatever their particular theatrical courses, they tend to struggle a bit with the actual theatre of it. Like they'll learn the techniques and they'll learn all the sleight of hand, they'll learn all the methods. But because most releases these days are more geared towards method than presentation, it's always something that gets a little bit overlooked. And it's to the extent where I've seen people who are doing the first show or whatever, and they'll go up onto a stage and they'll just perform trick after trick after trick with no real underlying script, no real continuous narrative, and the whole show looks slightly disjointed. So these are the sorts of people that I tend to get coming to me with They don't really know how to script effects and things like that, and they just want a little bit of guidance with it. I've had some fantastic responses with it, and I've found that from scripting other people, on top of it being very rewarding, people are always grateful for it, and it boosts the reactions that their audience give tenfold. It can be something as simple as making a card trick. I mean, we've all seen them card tricks where they'll deal out queens or whatever, and then they'll characterize the queens and talk about three ladies, and it doesn't make sense to an audience that isn't particularly enthralling. It doesn't attach with them on any sort of emotional level. So when you sort of start making it a little bit more connected with your audience, and when you start playing it in a way that's actually going to speak to them, and that's not just going to fly by, it significantly improves the magic. So to an extent, I think the scripting is equally, if not more important than the actual method that you're doing.
And it's so funny you say that. One of the first questions I wanted to bring up was Edward Mann asked, how important is scripting? And that obviously answers that question, and maybe you can expand on it a little bit more. But he also asks, as a second part to it, how often do you ad-lib?
With my act, I generally, being a mentalist, I like to be bold with everything I do. And a lot of that work means that quite a lot of the time I just guess. I just go out there and make a guess based on something. So if a particular route of guessing just so happens to be going well for me, then I follow that route. And if not, I tend to completely deviate away from it and go on to something else. I do a similar thing with hypnosis, whereas rather than hypnotizing someone on stage, which if it doesn't work can be risky, I'll start off by just faking it. And I'll ask the individual, can you just close your eyes and take a deep breath in and a deep breath out? And then at that point, they're not hypnotized, but everybody in the audience is convinced they are anyway. And I might go into a little bit more hypnosis talk, and if I see that the head starts to go down, they start giving me all the indications that they're hypnotized, I'm perfectly prepared to go on to just a demonstration of hypnosis. Whereas if I get to the point where they're not particularly responsive, I might go on to something like PK touches, something else that would be impromptu, something else that wouldn't require any props. So my show really, there's not a set linear narrative to it, it's kind of a lucid concept. Every single possibility within the script, I'm aware of where it fits, I'm aware of theatrically what I'm trying to present, but it's in no way fixed to one course. So,
So it's
I a lot. I completely make up the majority of my act on the spot. It's scripted, but it's scripted in so many different types. It's like a branching anagram, but with scripting.
right. It sounds like you have a bunch of scripts within your arsenal, but at any point you can go into a specific script or a set of scripts.
Yeah. But whenever I script, I always tend to move towards one particular. It might be a lesson, it might just be a message that I want the audience to take away. But that always underlines the whole thing. So if you were to draw up a diagram of my script, it'd probably look like a weird sort of tree with all branches coming off. But then they all deviate back onto the same point again. They all eventually converge on this final message, and that remains a constant. So the show still remains its integrity without me ever having to go off onto a completely different narrative.
Absolutely. So it's you have a diamond shaped script. It's
Yeah.
if you were to put a shape to it, that's great.
Yeah. An unusual shape.
Oh,
I can write that down on my website. Oliver Dobbs has an unusually shaped script.
that's right. Mentalism. That's your general preference along with hypnotism. How does mentalism different from magic in performance?
Well, what do you mean? How is it different from magic? Is that how is it different theatrically, or just how it makes the audience feel? What is it?
Well, I
To...
read the question almost verbatim as it was written, but if I were to infer, I would have to say that it sounds like when performing. You said earlier you perform card magic and the like. and then kind of moved into mentalism. And I understand that that's because when you go to less props, it seems more like it's just the two of you, even though it may not be. I feel like they're saying while you're performing it, to you, is there much of a difference between the two? Do they commingle? What would be your opinion?
I would say that the profound difference between the two is that mentalism has to sort of it's when you're performing magic and things like that. Obviously, it still has to have an emotional resonance, and it still has to build to a magical point. And it's the same with mentalism. A lot of mentalists will tell you that it can be sort of more slow and somber as long as it's mysterious. I've never been a big fan of that. I've always liked to end on an impact. I'd say that the crucial difference is that there are many, 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 many more bits of sort of logical explanations for what you do in mentalism. There's a lot more sort of spiritualism that could be put behind it. So, for example, there would be things like tarot card reading, things like tea leaf reading, palm reading, stuff like that. And if you're looking at ways to achieve goals, it could be stuff like micro-expression training, lie detection. It can be all sorts of psychological methods and physical methods. And this is something that I've always thought was important when performing mentalism or magic. There's the common school of thought going around that you should try to suspend their disbelief. And I don't know who came up with that saying, but I have never taken that literally. I've never thought that you should, within your magic, suspend people's disbelief completely. I think disbelief is part of the thing that makes it real to them. You have to allow questions, and you have to be open to those questions. So as part of my script, I always mention a logical course for what I'm doing. I might at some point mention that I'm trained in micro-expression reading or something like that. I never mention it explicitly because that's too obvious. It takes away from the magic. But I might mention that subtly. It can be something as simple as when I'm performing a word divination or something like that. I might want to look at the individual and say, there you go, your upper lip just trembled a little bit, because that implies that it's all based on the face. The difference is, because mentalism's got all these little psychological nuances and them sorts of things, there's many different ways to present that. With magic, whatever you do, the only logical explanation is that it's sleight of hand. There's no psychology to it. So at some point within a magic routine, you normally have to mention that you've trained as a sleight of hand artist. And I don't mean you have to mention that to take away from the fact that you're actually doing magic. Again, you mention that you were a sleight of hand artist because it allows people some sort of reasonable doubt. And the more they can sort of build on that doubt, the more impressive it makes it when it doesn't explain the finale. So I think the crucial difference between magic and mentalism is just that mentalism, it's much more cluttered in terms of all the sort of spiritual aspects that people apply to it.
Right. Oh, sorry, I just dropped over my Coke. I'll clean that up later. So, luckily I'm outside. Yay, balcony. So, feeding up off of that, it also seems, one thing I've always liked about mentalism over magic is that it's involved. Either one person or many. When you're performing magic, you can stand there on a stage and realistically perform an entire show without physically involving a spectator on stage with you. Whereas in mentalism, you need the audience. They need to be there, they need to participate, and that's crucial. It's much more about a connection than a performance, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think with magic, like you say, that you don't have to have the connection with the particular audience members. I often think you should put that in your show anyway, because from my time being a magician, whenever I used to write shows, I used to start off doing stuff that you could say was just sleight of hand, you could say was just skill. It was all stuff that I was just doing on my own, didn't really involve much audience participation. But then after that sort of thing, I'd bring the audience into it. And the narrative takes on the form of essentially showing off for the first section, but then flipping it round the other way and saying, well, I'm not the only one that can do this. The audience can do it as well. And then I tend to metaphorically tie that into some sort of ideal, something that they can take away from the show and that will resonate throughout their life. And then that's what I dub onto the end. The difference with mentalism is that you can't really do something that doesn't involve the audience member. As you say, it's impossible. So the narrative for mentalism is more even. It doesn't have the same ups and downs. To an extent, the scripting isn't as complicated with mentalism. It's pretty much audience participation throughout. Having said that, there are still ways that you can make them scripts work. And if you wanted to make it seem like you were doing it at the beginning, you could completely follow a psychological script and say you were doing it through lie detection or whatever. And then you could go on to do something completely different. It might be two-person telepathy. And you might metaphorically link that into just the connection that two people have. But it's just the question of making sure that you end off on the audiences being able to attribute the actions to themselves. You leave them thinking that they've had a significant role in it. I think the reason I chose mentalism above magic, and the honest truth is, I am absolutely terrible with my hands. And it's not to say I can't do sleight of hand and that sort of thing, as much as I can't do sleight of hand when people are watching me. That absolutely bothers me. And I don't even mind if people are watching my hands, because I know that I can do it. So if somebody sits there and absolutely watches my hands, then I can still do a magic set. It's when people look directly at me. I didn't like the idea that I was manipulating stuff in my fingers while they were looking at me. So I just kind of went away from that and thought, well, I'm going to stop manipulating them. I'm just going to make it into something that happens up here, so that there's no chance of them seeing anything, and there's no chance of them figuring anything out.
Right. Absolutely. That being said, I know you work some stage work, kind of parlor work. Do you work close up and stage?
I do work close up and stage. Recently, it's been more close up work than stage, because it tends to happen in bursts like that. My preferred environment has always been stage, and I do enjoy close up as well. I enjoy connecting with all the people, but for me, within close up, you're only ever going to get sort of 15, 20 minutes with each table, with each person, whereas on stage, you've got maybe an hour or so to just sit there and get your point across. So I appreciate the fact that I've got more time to do that. That's something that I don't take for granted. And I make sure that every moment of that hour is theatrically structured to give maximum impact and to give them the maximum emotional response at the end of the show.
Okay, so going from that then, do you find it harder scripting for for close-up for only 20 minutes or so, when you have like a starting point and an ending point, you want to get there as quick as possible? That has to be difficult.
I think the thing is with close-up magic, it's about addressing the same concept, but as you've mentioned, you've got to do it very quickly. There's not as much messing about with it. With close-up, every effect that you do has to have a point to it. Whereas when you're doing a stage show, as long as you've sort of got the original point that you wanted to make, the point at the end, and all the sort of little bits in between somewhere, it doesn't really matter. There's little bits of your act that can be tweaked, taken out, and replaced with other things. Whereas when you're doing close-up, because you've only got a couple of tricks, you've obviously got to pack every single bit of drama into just 2 routines, which is difficult to do. I always like to, for example, add drama into any close-up routine that I do. And that might be something along the lines of deliberately failing an effect and then pulling it back at the end. Or it might be something like leaving a really long pause for something. For example, in Paul Brooks' book, Chrysalis of a Polymath, when he was talking about the Knight's tour routine, he mentioned a stage in his routine where he'd sit there with his head down, completely silent, for as long as he could until the audience started to get restless. And I think that's a crucial thing within theatre. I think leaving them huge pauses is essential because it leaves them room to doubt that it's going to work. If you're just going to come out there and pass everything you do, you're just going to succeed, succeed, succeed. There's no mystery to it at all. From start to finish, it's very much, this is going to happen. Whereas if you get to the middle and then you put a little bit of something problematic in, it just makes the ending so much more impressive. So that being said, with a 20-minute routine, bearing in mind that every effect I perform tends to take at least 10 minutes, I only realistically have time for 2 routines. So logically, the second routine has to either have a massive pause in it or fail at the beginning and then bring it back at the end. So that limits me greatly to what I can actually do.
Well, and see, and I like that you talk about scripting so heavily. Something that is heavily overlooked, I feel, is the idea that because there's this big argument as magic as a art or magic as a craft, and it's both and can be looked at as both ways. But I think that people forget the art side. The art is the acting, is the drama, is the scripting, whereas the crafting is the working, it's the manipulation, it's the whatever it may be, whatever work you're physically putting into it. The learning.
What I tend to find is with magic, because it's very visual, because everything you do is supposed to be as visual as possible, people tend to forget about the scripting side to it. Whereas with mentalism, because you're essentially standing on a stage and just talking for ages, people tend to forget about the exact opposite. They tend to completely forget the visual aspects. For example, when someone's hypnotizing, these days not a lot of hypnotists use props. A lot of them will stand there and just hypnotize somebody, and it doesn't look visual enough. It's not a nice image to have in your mind, and it's very important what your stage looks like. It's very important the props you use. It's all about building a theme. So even if you wanted to completely go off from what modern hypnosis really teaches you, and you wanted to go to the sort of old-fashioned Svengali routines with the pendulum, just moving it back and forth like that, it might seem old-fashioned. It might seem completely out of the ordinary, but it's a nice visual moment. It can be stuff like, for example, when I'm hypnotizing people on stage, sometimes I slow everything right down so that the induction becomes part of the theatre. And when I do that sort of thing, I tend to have a metronome in the background. So I get the ticking of the metronome and this whole image in their mind of this ticking. And I sort of structure my words to correspond with the ticking. And it just makes it such a visually and auditory beautiful piece. So it's not just all about talking, it's about making it into an image. You've got to imagine that every magic effect that you do, be it mentalism or magic, within their mind when they look back on that, they don't remember the whole thing. Nobody does that. This is why when people recall things, they're always wrong. They always miss out details that are necessary to figure out the effect. It's because they're not seeing the effect as a whole. They're seeing a big picture, a big still picture with start, finish. It's he did this and this happened. That's all in the same picture. So if you can make it as visual as possible, it's just making it resonate that much more in the head. And on top of that, using props and stuff like that, it adds a little bit of heat to the props, which completely takes it away. If you're not using that prop as a gimmick or something like that, it just distracts them from the fact that you're actually doing exactly what you say you're doing.
Right, and I've only seen a few hypnotists actually perform stage hypnotism that was their thing.
Yeah.
That was one thing I always was disappointed in, was all the way through the induction, it was very quiet on stage, and he was up in like every single one, just very, very quiet. Nothing went on. Lights just dimmed and a little bit of music, and for the audience, that's just a dead waste of time.
Yeah.
And it was part of the show. And I mean, people pay good money a lot of times to come and see people perform, and to make them sit in a chair for 20 minutes while you're trying to pull inductions on 15 participants is just ludicrous, and I can't understand why people do that.
Yeah, yeah. The thing is, when you're doing stage hypnosis and that sort of stuff, you're going to have to do one or two things. You can either rush it, in which case you're not as likely to get a powerful induction. You've not had as much time to ease them into it, there's more chance of failure. Or you can just completely go slow with the whole thing and just dial your whole show down. My show, for example, is quite slow paced. I don't perform one effect after another, after another, after another, because I felt like that was too much of an impact on my audience. It was giving them too much to think about. So instead, my whole show is slowed down. For example, in my word divination act, which I normally do as the second routine in my act, this comes after my introduction, I tend to, rather than doing it quickly, rather than just revealing what words somebody's thinking of, because that wouldn't be a very good trick, I'd get the person up onto the stage, and again, even rather than standing up, I calm everything down. I have two chairs on the stage, I sit down, they sit down, and I go through the scripting as slowly as I want. It's all about building drama, so I take as many pauses as I think are necessary. I'm very careful and very concise with what sort of timing I leave. And I think timing is something that's important. No matter how good your script is, if you rush it or if you go too slow with it, it's going to come across the wrong way. So my show, I found, tends to come across better when I perform everything a bit slower. And that being said, since I've already got the audience in this environment of everything's relaxed, we're just sitting down playing these little exercises, when I want to do an induction, the induction part of it is actually a mystery within itself. I don't try to do it as a sort of fast-paced, and you're under, and then reveal something or make them do something in particular. That, for me, isn't part of the show. For example, if I started sitting there doing a really slow word divination, and then I automatically got somebody onto the stage, hypnotized them down, and got them to forget their own name, the speed of it's completely off. I've gone from slow to being right up there. It's like I've had a load of sugar in between. It doesn't make sense. So bringing the tone of the show down allows you to spend more time on the induction. I'd say if you're not particularly skilled with instant inductions, and instant inductions can be difficult things to do. They can be very daunting because it requires a lot of risk. If you're not familiar with instant inductions, I would advise to slow your whole show down. As opposed to just doing a slow induction in your show anyway, slow the whole thing down, because otherwise you're going to end up with inappropriately fast and slow bits, and it doesn't make sense for anyone.
Right, right. You know, make it. I think that was the point I was making, was that it was moving part of the show, nothing was going on. If it was, you know, if there was scripting going on, if there was things going on, it would have been a completely different story. But you know, having all that time where you're just like, it's you and the person on stage, and it's like you forget about everybody else there. It's never okay to forget about the rest of the audience.
Yeah.
See what I'm saying? So let's before we keep on going, just you and I talking. We got some more questions coming in. Frank Tugas asks how many set pieces you have ready to go, and how many are in various stages of development.
Set pieces for hypnosis. If you look at Anthony Jacquin's Manchurian approach, every set piece that he performs on that, I actually do in real life. On top of that, I also do the thing with the pendulum, but as opposed to me holding it, I ask them to hold it and see if I can create some sort of ideomotor effect out of that. I also use, if you look at James Tripp has got a free course called Hypnosis Without Trance. He performs an effect where you stick someone's foot to the floor. I use that as a set piece. It's a lot of ideomotor stuff. If I'm going to do something like an instant induction, obviously that doesn't require a set piece. It's still very highly structured. For example, I do something where I call people up on stage and I immediately go to shake the person's hand, and then they shake the hand, and I point down to a spot on the floor and say, sorry, mind that wet patch. And at that point they look down to start avoiding this wet patch, and I even take a step back to imply that they should take a step back. And then I start giving them all sorts of various commands along the way, and just stand there. And it's just conditioning them into generally being responsive. And that's pretty much as instant an induction as I do. I start going through, just stand like that for me, and then I just tug their arm and just sleep. And because you've conditioned them to continuously follow what you're saying, that tends to bring them down pretty quickly. That wouldn't count as a set piece, I understand, but don't worry too much about the amount of set pieces that you perform. I'd say that just get a few little set pieces and just perform them every time. For example, the fingers coming together is a very good set piece. Sticking a hand to a table, that's fantastic. You might also want to consider sticking a hand to a floor and getting them to raise the hand up into the air when they can actually take it off the floor. That can be very visual if you stick everyone to the floor, because then you can say, and it's going to be come unstuck now. And then everybody raises their hand at once, and that's a beautifully visual moment for everyone. It's not so much about having a lot of set pieces as much as just trusting in the ones that you've got. You've got to understand that all a set piece is, it's just a little sort of way to test whether or not you're going to be able to move on to the next stage. And that's not saying it can't be an effect within itself. This is still a strong effect if you present it properly. Hand sticking to a table, it's not something that you'd normally experience. It seems like genuine magic to the audience. So if you succeed in them sorts of things, then you can normally move on to do sort of deeper level trance inductions and things like that. If you get in a sort of failed response, just try to pull it back the best you can and just say that that's the effect. For example, I've had situations where I've told somebody that the hand's going to become stuck, and then I've had to try as hard as you can to unstick that hand, and they've immediately taken it off the table. So what I do in that situation is I say, excellent, just keep that hand there, and just imagine that there's a weight on the back of the hand pushing it back down to the table, and then when the hand finally goes down, which it will because their arm's getting tired, by the time it goes down to the table, I can now say, and now, can you feel the difference? And then they say, yes. And then you say, okay, now try to unstick the hand. So I pull it back, and the majority of the time, the second go, they won't be able to unstick it. So even if something goes wrong, still try to pull it back anyway, because the beauty of hypnosis is, if you keep going, you normally get there in the end.
Right, absolutely. Now, you do the sticking of the hands and a lot of that sticking of the floor. We had a conversation. You stuck everybody to the floor. And you told me about that. That was a great story. Maybe you can share it here in a minute. But what's the difference, or is there a difference in the effects you perform on stage versus the effects you play close up? Besides.
When I'm performing on stage, then do you mean specifically hypnotism-wise, or do you mean just in terms of general?
I'd say perform in general.
Okie dokie. In general, when I come out onto a stage, I tend to think that the way that you control your audience is a little bit different. Point out a participant and start telling them just random details of their life. And then I point to another participant and do the same thing. And there's a very considerate reason why I do that. I do that because talking to all them people one at a time gets the rest of the audience thinking, what if I'm next? So they're all listening. Sorry, did you try to say something? It looked like I
we actually lost you there for a second. Can you say that again? Right as you were going into, I mean, I know what you do, but right as you're going into the first thing you do on stage, and cut out for a second.
Yeah. When I'm on stage, I reveal random details of a person, and then I go on to another person, and I do the same thing, and I do that for person after person after person, just revealing random details. And the reason that I do that is because that way everybody starts thinking, what if I'm next? So with everybody thinking, what if I'm next, the whole audience starts paying attention. Obviously, when you're in a close-up environment, that'd be a bit weird. You don't want to just come up and start pointing to people on the chairs and telling them things. And on top of that, because you're quite close up anyway, you can see that they're already paying attention. So when I'm doing a close-up set, I don't tend to perform big things like that. I tend to bring everything closer to me. It might be things like a memorized deck routine, and any card at any number, that sort of thing. I perform word divination as well, is a big thing. The difference between when I'm on stage and when I do close-up with reveals, and it's not so much the effect that's different, it's the way that I reveal the effect that's different. So if, for example, I'm in a small group and I ask one of them to think of a random word, and then after some deliberation I guess what that word is, all the people in the audience, even if that word hasn't been written down, to a small audience, they can see the reaction of the individual, so they play off that. Whereas if you're on stage and you point to someone in the audience and start doing that for them, nobody can now see their reaction. So if I'm doing something like a word divination, a drawing duplication, something like that, then I tend to get it written down and just get it revealed in a different way. So rather than actually changing my effects, because I think my effects, the majority of them are propless, the majority of them can work close up or on stage. So as opposed to changing the effect, I just slightly tweak how I reveal it at the end.
That I think that answered that quite well. Sorry, it's hard to go back through on questions on my phone right now. I'm trying to speak slow. No, and absolutely. Addressing a large audience is always a little bit more difficult. It'd be different. It would be different if you come here and had them on stage with you. Then it'd be much more like the close-up aspect, where everybody can now focus on the eyes of the audience and then empathize. Because that's what you're getting when you get somebody on stage. Is you need empathy. That's what you're trying to achieve vicariously.
Yeah.
Frank asks, what is the difference between stage hypnotism and clinical hypnotism, and how are they similar?
The difference between stage hypnotism and close-up hypnotism is that I would say close-up hypnotism is significantly more difficult. Because if you're doing close-up hypnotism, you've got no out. You've got to be spot on with it. The majority of the time, they want to see an induction, and they want the person to genuinely be hypnotized because they want to be able to request that you ask the person to do different things. If you were working on a stage, again, you don't actually have to hypnotize a person. You can just ask them to close their eyes and put their head down, and then see if they're getting hypnotized anyway. And if you see signs of hypnosis, if you see the head going down, if you see the breathing naturally getting deeper, you know that they're hypnotized, so you can build from that. If you're doing an induction on stage, I wouldn't call what I do with bringing people onto the stage, sitting them down and setting the metronome going, I wouldn't call that a stage hypnosis effect, because I bring the person to me, everything's close up, and I perform the induction exactly like I would in a close-up environment. Because getting the sort of two chairs set up with a little table in between, I'm essentially forming a mini close-up environment that the audience look in onto. So my performance on stage is very similar to what I do close-up. But if you're not confident enough with inductions, if you don't feel you get a high enough hit rate to just go out there and pick an audience member and try it, then you can try little set pieces with the audience. I personally wouldn't bother. I would bring someone up onto the stage, ask them to close their eyes, and just run through it. If they get hypnotized, you can always perform some hypnosis effect. You can make yourself invisible or whatever. If they don't, there's no reason you can't go into a lift effect or something like that. You're not fixed on what you can do. It's all about having all these little tools and little tricks and things in your tool belt that you can just produce at any moment. So if something's not particularly going your way, you can still deviate back so that it looks like it's going your way, because you've got to remember the audience don't know where it's going in the first place. So whereas with close-up hypnosis, they do very much want to see that an individual is hypnotized. So you're pretty fixed to what you can do. On stage, you can do whatever you want. It's two completely separate worlds. What the audience is seeing and what is actually going on are completely different things. So what's happening on stage doesn't even have to be hypnosis. I would suggest that if you can achieve hypnosis, then it can be a beautifully theatrical thing to do, But it's whether you're confident enough to risk your stage show in that way.
So realistically, at least with the stage you have out, if you're talking about clinical up close hypnosis, it better work.
Yeah, yeah. But a little bit of audience management that I use when I'm doing close-up is if I'm working with a table that's maybe got 3 people on or something, and I don't particularly think that the 3 people could be hypnotized, or if I don't feel that there's a large enough number of people around to perform hypnosis, leaving a statistical chance that one of them is going to be hypnotizable, I just bring more audience members in. So I might go to another table and say, sorry, would you like to watch this as well? Just bring in loads of people, and then doing your set pieces, you'll find that because you've brought more people in, the odds of you actually hypnotizing someone go through the roof. So as opposed to leaving out, it's just about increasing your odds of success.
Right, right. No, and that's see, and it's hypnosis. When we've talked about this, is something I've been studying. You've been helping me with, and that's generally what is it? It's one in 3 people, or no? One in 3 people can be hypnotized theoretically. Was the statistic I heard?
I think technically, I think it's about 1 in 5. I found it to be a lot more than that. I found that a lot more people can be hypnotized than statistics say can. And I think the reason that they dismiss certain people as not being hypnotizable is because they just give up when they get a little bit of difficulties. When they get a little bit of conflict, they think they can't be hypnotized. In actuality, I think the reason that some people can't be hypnotized is because they put barriers up. So if you hit a barrier, if you hit a particular block, it's your job to assess what that block is and to comfort the participant into letting that go. And the second that they can let that go, you might find that a participant that used to be very difficult just goes down really, really easily. So when doing hypnosis and stuff, don't worry too much about the statistics. Don't worry about what percentage of people can be hypnotized. Just trust that if somebody can't be hypnotized, make it happen. You've just got to go in there and make it happen as quickly and as efficiently as possible.
That's awesome, man. I know you create a bunch of stuff. You've had releases with Kidnapper, right?
Yeah.
You've had releases of your own. Matt Chalk actually asks, what kind of advice do you have for a young creator in the minimalist world?
What I would say to young creators, and not just creators that are going to release effects, but creators that are just creating effects to go within their show, I'd say never ever start with your method. And when I say never start with your method, that's a bit of an unusual thing, because I know a lot of people don't start off saying, I've got an idea for a method, so what effect can I do? But I mean, even the effect, don't start off with that, because they're completely irrelevant. It's all towards making the audience feel a particular way. So rather than starting off with, I've got this method, or rather than starting off with, I want to reveal a thought-of word, start off with a sort of more imaginary, more emotional construct. So for example, I've got a release coming out soon, and the idea behind the effect is it's the word revelation that I perform. The thought that I put into that creative process, I didn't at any point consider a word revelation at the beginning of the thing. I went straight into thinking, what do I want the audience to perceive? And my idea was that I wanted to address confusion. I wanted to address that.
Still there? I think we lost you again.
When you look at it. Yep.
Oh, you're back.
Where did you lose me?
Sorry about that. I'm not sure what's going on. Every once in a while you drop out.
Where did you lose me?
Addressing confusion.
What?
You wanted
Addressing
to address confusion.
Yeah. The idea behind the effect was that the more you look at something, you can find often the more sort of clouded you make it in your mind. And this is something that everybody can relate to. When people are working, when people are doing their hobbies, when people are doing general things. They work very hard on stuff and it all confuses it in their head. And you find often when you take a step back, it all becomes clear. And that's the concept that I wanted to get into an effect. So the creation of my effect didn't start off with how am I going to reveal a word. It didn't start off with I'm going to reveal a word. It started off with what I was going to do, and then I said to myself, how can I make people feel this way? And my idea was that I'd get somebody to think of something, and then I gradually blur that out in their minds so that it becomes a more sort of unusual concept, and it becomes unclear to them as well as to me. And then after that, I'd be able to bring them right back into the moment of clarity and just reveal it at the end. So rather than starting off with methods and effects, start off with feelings and build backwards from there.
Great advice. And we spoke earlier. We were talking about scripting. I mean, scripting seems to be the key point it all coming back to is how, because it's, I mean, it's something I've always struggled with personally, because when I want to make a show, I think in my head first, okay, well, coherency. That's my main point. I want it point A to point B needs to be coherent throughout. So I'll add things, I'll subtract things, and I'll change things to try to achieve that. But it's always been that tough thing to kind of do. Can you go through your process on how you kind of touched on this on the last product, just how you go through front to back on an effect? You know what I'm saying, creating?
If it's just thinking about one effect, it's pretty easy to script just one effect in general.
What about a show?
You can start off from the feeling, and then you can say what effect perfectly demonstrates my point. So if you were going to perform two-person telepathy, you might want to perform a two-person telepathy act as a sort of psychic link between two people. But you might want to make it into a concept that's more emotional and more relatable for the audience. You might want to address, for example, distance. You might want to talk about when relatives, when friends and family move away to the other side of the seas, and it can be very distressing for you, but at the end of the day it doesn't matter because you've always got a link to them. And that might be the basis for your two-person telepathy effect. At that point you've pretty much sorted your script out for your two-person telepathy effect. When you're doing a show, it's a little bit different. You don't have to mention in every effect that you perform sort of what your basic concept that you're going to outline at the end is. So if your basic concept at the end was going to be the miracles happen all around you, you wouldn't have to make the audience complete every single effect, but you might think theatrically, how am I going to prove that miracles happen all around you? You need to first start off by demonstrating that miracles can happen, which would be doing it yourself. Then you need to start off by saying, now you can make a miracle happen, and then you need to seem to make miracles happen accidentally. And this might be performing an effect that seems out of your control. It might be something like linking rings, for example, as opposed to trying to put the rings together. You might be trying to take the rings apart. You might be showing people 1 ring, 2 ring, 3 rings, and then you might find that the final rings are joined together just accidentally. You make it look like it's all some sort of happy accident, because that way it makes the magic seem like it's just something that naturally comes. It's not something that you're doing, it's not something that they're doing, it's just one of those miracles that happens. So in terms of how to create a show, as opposed to how to sort of create the scripting for an effect, I'd say that the things you need to think about. First of all, an audience will never stop questioning how you do something. It's impossible to stop an audience from questioning. It's human nature to look at something and try to figure out how it's done. So give them a wonderful explanation for why they can do that. For example, you might use the idea that it's just the connection that they feel with friends and family and that sort of thing, and that's absolutely fine. But what if the audience don't believe that? If the audience don't believe that, you've then got a problem, because then they start to backtrack and think about all sorts of trickery and them sorts of things. Which is why what I mentioned earlier about finding a sort of logical method like psychology or sleight of hand or that sort of thing and just incorporating that into a little bit of suggestion at the beginning. That's another little thing that you've got to incorporate. So at some point, you want a routine that you will be able to suggest that it's sleight of handing, or that you'll be able to suggest that you're doing facial expression reading. And then towards the end, you might have this effect that shows that the magic's happening accidentally. So you've already got a significant portion of your script actually written up anyway. You've just got to think of these little points, and the effects run completely outside of that. You've just got to think, does the effect fit into the bit in the script that it's supposed to? It's not so much important what effect you put in there, as long as they are relevant for the part of the script. So I'd say write your narrative first. Write it out as a lesson with set sort of, I don't suppose lesson would be the right word, write it down as a curriculum with set lessons along the way would be a better way of putting it. It's a progression of ideas that leads to this moment of understanding at the end. And as you run along that progression of ideas, you're showing them one little bit at a time, building up their belief to get to the final finale. So once you've got that narrative down, that's the only time when you should be thinking about effects. When you start making your script fit your effects, your script gets very muddled. When you start making your effects fit your script, you find very easily things just start to slot into place. And on top of that, something people do is that they want to put an effect into their show because they like the effect, even though it might not fit your narrative. So they'll just dub some random effect in there that's not even relevant. This could be, for example, if I were performing a mentalism show, and halfway through I'd performed some routine, I'd performed the zigzag routine. It would look utterly bizarre. You wouldn't do it. You could perform it on some sort of mentalism lesson, but it's a bit of a stretch. As long as it fits in with your narrative, it doesn't matter. But if it doesn't fit in with your narrative, you've got to force yourself to step away from that. You've got to force yourself to say, well, maybe in another show. It doesn't fit in with the show that I'm doing, so it's not going into the set.
You know, and it's kind of funny, and I think it's maybe it's more mentalist performers that feel this way. I was talking to Peter Nardi a week or so ago, and he was talking about how he likes to, like, he'll just keep on running through the show and start taking as much as he can out of it. Like, you know, minimalist. Like, what is my point? What am I getting at? Let's get there. Okay, this isn't needed. And his was purely because he didn't want to have to put that much at that time into it. He just, you know, he's like, let's deal with the things I can deal with. It'll make that much easier. I can focus on the audience. I can focus on what I'm doing, and I don't have to be thinking about what's coming up next and all this stuff. So, like, when you say slow it down, go at your own pace, I mean, you're really, I mean, there's a technique in sales for pacing your, or controlling the pace of your, stooge, if you want to call them that. Whoever your customer is. So like it's very much just sitting there and pacing your audience, controlling the flow of the show. That's something that it's kind of left up to the audience most time. Of okay, well, you know, however you feel, that's how the show is going.
Yeah, yeah. But you'd be amazed how many times I've seen new performers come into the game and they buy as many tricks as they can, and then they come out onto the stage and they say, pick a card, and then they do a card trick, and then they pick another card, and then they keep doing just effect. And the effects aren't joined together by an ongoing narrative, so it's just a series of tricks. It's not got a meaning to it. It's not got an explanation. So they come across as disjointed. Whereas I think when you get to the point where you stop thinking, I've got to be performing all the time, and I think it's a confidence thing more than anything. I mean, you'll know as well as I do, the first time you go out and perform for a crowd of people, it's terrifying. You go out, you step out in front of the people, and you feel so small by comparison. You almost feel like you've got to fill the time because you're not interested enough in yourself that they'll enjoy you just talking to them. Like, people who aren't funny. Some people are funny and some people are not. But people tend to assume unless you're a comedian, you can't stand there and just hold a crowd with your words. And it's not the case. You can stand there and just talk to people like you would in a conversation. You can explain concepts to them. So as opposed to getting the idea in your head that they're not going to be interested in what you're saying, so you need to keep tricking them. Take the complete
I think we lost.
idea in me, and the tricks just sort of run as little bits along that.
I lost you at take B, and I'm assuming the exact opposite is where you're going with that.
Yeah, yeah.
All
Sorry,
right.
what? The video,
What's up?
the video keeps going a bit funny.
Yeah, here and there you get a little bit freezy, but no, absolutely, man. I get what you're saying. Let's see here. I think we got okay. I think we got one more question, and then we can finish with a little bit more the scripting lecture if you'd like.
Yeah,
That sound
yeah.
good to you?
Yeah.
Okay, so we have Frank Tugas was wondering, and I think I already know the answer to this question, but I'd like it answered explicitly anyway. Where's your favorite? What's your favorite venue for a performance? Is it close up? Is it stage? Where do you feel you shine best?
My favourite venue is and always will be working on stage. I love stage performances. If I'm talking about specific venues, you get them sort of pubs that have a stage, and they can give you some really tough crowds. Like you'll get people standing around at the bars, and you get lots of hecklers and them sorts of people. But just the challenge that it presents, to have people sitting there drinking, to have people sitting around tables and enjoying themselves, and you're just sort of working on the stage, it's quite difficult to get those people to then pay attention to what you're doing. So I really appreciate the challenge that comes along with that. It's different to if you were at something like a festival and you were standing on the stage, because in them situations, people know that you're the entertainer. People are there to watch you, whereas in a pub, people are there to drink. So I personally prefer like little pubs and bars and places with a stage, because generally I find that's the most challenging and they're the most enjoyable situations that I find myself in.
Well, I mean, you're talking about how we talk about a lot is hypnosis is so much about confidence, and I think if you're enjoying yourself, that just makes that extra confidence shine that much more.
Yeah. I
Absolutely.
think if I was going to say what my least favourite performance venue was, though, I actually had a charity gig with quite a large number of people. It was the kind of numbers that you'd expect for a stage show. So it was a large number of people, and it was quite a big room. But for some bizarre reason, the room that they hired didn't have a stage. So you've got all these people gathering around at floor level, and little old me at floor level, they can't even see me. And I'm quite a tall person, so they should be able to at least see what I'm doing. But the majority of the people just couldn't see what was going on. And that for me was such a pain in the backside venue, just because trying to shout over everybody and get towards the back, you tend to find when people can't hear, you can't get their attention. There's no way. The fact that they can't see you means that you're not a show to them. You're just something happening at the other side of the room. So you can sit there and tell them to be quiet as much as you like, they won't. So I tend to like to be on a stage, and visible is normally the great thing.
Right, yeah, that was something I actually, I had the bright idea at one point actually to go out and try to do a stage show without speakers on at an art festival. That wasn't exactly my brightest moment because shouting. I got about halfway through the set and was like, all right, I'm gonna go out and do close up now because we were at floor level anyway. So I brought my partner out and we went out and did a bunch of close up because it just if people can't hear you and what you're saying is important to the routine, you're screwed. There's no entertainment value for them.
Yeah. You find when you're doing things like that as well, for example, for a magician, it would be better to go into close-up and that sort of stuff. As a mentalist, you can go into things like sideshow entertainment, things like that. You can even potentially go into like stuff that's more sort of game based. So, for example, you'll have seen probably the Derren Brown routine where he plays a game of noughts and crosses with someone, and he does it completely without looking at the board. That sort of thing plays great for them scenarios where you've just got a crowd of people around you, and the people towards the back can't see. It's a close-up game, but it's just big enough that the crowd can still get on board with it. I have had problems with the past in those scenarios creating themselves. I was once sat at a table performing an ESP card routine, and I was performing it for like one or two people. But then some other people went past, some friends of these people, so they turned around and, oh, come and look at this. So the other people came along and started looking at that, which was fine. I was like, right, numbers are getting bigger, so we'll sit there and continue with the SP card work. And then some more people came in, oh, come and look at this. And very quickly I found that the room filled up with people. So there was no room anymore. They were spilling out the door. And I was there sat at a table with ESP cards. Like, how do I entertain a crowd? They weren't even big ESP cards. The people at the back don't know what's happening. At the end of the day, I just thought, in this scenario, I've not been hired to do it. It was just something I was doing. So I'm just going to carry on doing what I'm doing. And
Yeah, I think I probably would have done the same thing. I mean, at that point, they're just coming to see whatever it is you're doing anyway, so they have to wait their damn turn. Oh, excuse me, their turn.
well, because you're doing close up and then the people come, to then start doing something that play for the big audience, you'd first have to tell the people up close to go away a little bit, because you need your space to do that sort of thing anyway. And I'd find that personally rude to say, can you step back a little bit? So I just continued to do whatever I was doing.
Right. All right, well, we just hit our hour mark. I don't know how long we have you for.
However long you want me for, to be honest with you. I haven't got a set time limit to conform to.
Well, I know we were talking earlier about you doing a quick lecture on scripting, and I didn't know if you had anything you wanted to perform for the audience either. So either.
What was this? Sorry, your speech broke up a bit then.
Oh, I was saying, I know that earlier we spoke about having you do either a performance or possibly doing a little bit of lecturing on scripts. So I'm going to go with dealer's choice on this one.
Yeah. Are we actually seeing if people vote for one or the other and see what happens?
No, you. No, you're the dealer on this one.
Oh, okay. I think we're going to struggle to do a performance solely because the camera keeps jolting, and the effect I had in mind was a card trick where the cards are laid down. So I think with the camera being a bit jolty, I don't think it'll quite play to my advantage. Probably best to go further into the scripting with it.
Okay, then let's finish off on a short lecture on scripting, because this is something that I would benefit from as well.
Yeah. Right, in terms of writing a script, and I always tell people this, I always tell every single person that comes to me this, it's absolutely about emotion. So whatever you think about. If you're thinking about a story, for example, you might think, my story's got to be interesting. Your story hasn't got to be interesting. Your story's got to be emotional. If your effect's going to be visual, it doesn't matter if it's visual. It's got to be emotional. If your effect is one of those effects with 3 lucky ladies, the queens, it could be a story like that as long as it's emotional. So it's all about making your audience feel a particular way. So you want to start off with a feeling. So when I perform my stage show, the feeling that I want to leave the audience with, I want them to feel empowered. I want them to feel like they've gained some sense of achievement or something. And this is, if I were performing, for example, my memorized deck routine, the idea to the memorized deck routine doesn't conform to the idea of empowerment. And this is actually the train of thought that I went through when I was creating my memorized deck / Acorn routine, Eidetic. I wanted it to be empowering for the audience, and yet the idea of memorizing a deck of cards and then reciting that order seemed to be very much showing off. So, scripting-wise, I then had to think of a way, how am I going to get this person to feel like their memory has been improved? So I then thought, well, now I've got to get them to memorize the deck afterwards, which is the second stage of the routine. But because I wanted the routine to be more profound than that, I wanted to leave them with the sense of empowerment. So that wasn't the final phase of the routine. And the final phase of the routine, and the thing that gets the callbacks, is that I permanently improve the memory of the individual. It's completely based on chance. All I do is I look them right in the eye, and I say to them, so you've just seen as an example that your memory can work absolute wonders under the right circumstances and when prompted in the right way. And I tell them that outside of anything that we're doing, that's a potential that they've always had, and that they can absolutely hold on to that for as long as they want. And then I tend to go and just tap them on the forehead and say, and in fact, from now on, your memory is going to be significantly better than it ever was before today, and it will be a notable improvement. And when that happens, and then I hand them a business card and I say, I want you to give me a call and let me know. So it creates sort of repeat bookings, and you'd be surprised the amount of callbacks you get from that, genuinely creating life change for these individuals. And it's not improving their memory, obviously, you can't do that. But we've all had weird moments where we've remembered something that we didn't think we'd be able to. Like someone will say, who was the 5th winner of Big Brother? And you just sort of know. For example, I know the first person to win Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, even though I was, God knows how young when that happened, and it wasn't significant to me at the time. So I trust that them sorts of things are going to keep happening, which is why I can say to them at the end that it's going to happen, and then they're going to give me a call. So I attribute anything that happens that's unusual after that point to being something that I've achieved. You can do that a lot with scripting. You might want to think, if I'm giving them a power, do I really want to take this away at the end? If you're doing something, for example, that's supposed to be for a couple, if you were doing something like the routine with playing cards, where they both have a deck of playing cards and they shuffle them and then they take one out and it turns out that the playing cards both match, and it's very romantic for a couple. But you might want to talk about how that connection between them is going to keep going. And you might want to talk about how from that moment on, they're going to be one of the most connected couples in the world. From that moment on, they're going to find that they're so in sync, they're going to keep all that energy between them is going to stay with them for the rest of their lives. And then you might find that at points, they'll finish each other's sentences and then immediately be on the phone to you telling you that they've done it. So as a little scripting tip for the end of that, think to yourself, if I'm going to give someone an ability, am I going to take it away? Or am I going to just sort of keep that running onward as a form of advertising and as something to inevitably leave them feeling a lot better about themselves? As I've mentioned, you do need to give your routines a sort of a logical premise. And the reason that I say you need to give your routine a logical premise is, first of all, to catch skeptics. If you've got a skeptic in your audience and you're talking about subconscious connections between romantically attached individuals, that skeptic is going to sit there and think, I don't believe that for a second. So you need a logical premise to back up on. And that logical premise, in making it a small suggestion, in making it something that's such a small part of your show that you'd normally completely overlook it, only the skeptics are going to latch onto that. But it just lets them go off and do their own thing while everybody else is enjoying themselves. And it stops them from having that conversation afterwards where these people are really pleased with what's happened and this person's coming in saying, oh, well, it's all a trick, because then whatever that person says, it's still a logical thing anyway. And I've had situations where I've impressed a whole load of people, and then someone towards the back has said, oh yeah, but that's all based on body language, isn't it? And the reason he said that is because I suggested at the beginning of the show that it was based on body language. So he just repeated back to me what I'd already suggested to him was the cause. And the other people in the audience were sat there going, body language? Because the way that the routine was structured, the final effect couldn't have possibly been body language. Right. So all that does, this person is so intent on believing that you're not magic that that's what he holds on to. But the other people, because they're looking at it in a much more broad way, think, well, could it have been body language? And that's when they'll go back to that emotional state that you've created. So create them seedlings of doubt within your own act. It seems counterintuitive to create doubt within a magic act, but you've got to catch the skeptics. You've got to have that little safety net underneath to just filter out all the little skeptics and to make sure that they're not going to damage the effect after the show's stopped. Another reason that you want to have a little logical premise in the background is because ultimately, if you do get people that are emotionally invested, but they have picked up on what you were doing earlier, and you might get people that they'll be invested in the idea, but they'll still sit there doubting it, thinking, oh, it's just suggestion, it's just suggestion. And then it gets to the end and it can't possibly be, and that just makes it so much more dramatic to them, because now you've led them down the garden path and they've just completely knocked it out of the way. So it sort of takes the ground out beneath their feet. And I think that's a really important thing that not a lot of people do. And importantly as well, I think a lot of people tend to script their effect to be purely logic. They tend to say to their audience, I am reading your facial expressions to guess what drawing you're thinking of. But when you think about how people believe, if you think about any religious debate you've ever had, when you start talking to someone about an idea and saying that they are definitively wrong and that it's particularly this is the way it is, they automatically resist. It's human nature. We don't like being told what to think. So if you start telling people that it's possible to read someone's facial expressions and guess what image they're thinking of, if they don't believe that, you've lost them already. You've got to let them think it's their idea. So as opposed to, if that's the image you want to convey, as opposed to telling them that that's what's happening, they won't latch onto that. Suggest it at the beginning and then start adding on layers of sort of maybe supernatural stuff, maybe emotional stuff, that sort of thing, and just let them draw the conclusions by themselves. Because something that they've thought of is always a better explanation than something you've thought of. So I personally wouldn't recommend structuring an entire script around, well, this is facial expression reading, this is body language, something like that. Just as in the same way, I believe that sleight of hand artists are a completely separate thing to magicians. And I appreciate it's the same effects, it's just presented in a way that's not magic. Because sleight of hand isn't magic. Magic is something that's inexplainable. So when you say, I'm achieving this by sleight of hand, the implication is that you're not a magician. So I'd say that the art form is akin to being a magician because they use the same methods, but the presentation is a completely different thing. And I would say if you're going to perform magic, make sure that any mention of sleight of hand, any mention of any logical means of achieving something, make sure that it's only a subtle bit where you mention it. If you mention it throughout, then it ceases to be magic. That being said, the more emotional concepts around it, and it's the exact same thing. If you wanted someone to believe in a particular ideal, and this might be that the connections between people are so profound that you consistently just got thoughts going on between your heads that you can pick up on other people's thoughts, you can influence other people to do different things. That might be a completely acceptable thing to tell people. But if you explicitly say that, the people are going to sit there and think, that's not true, that doesn't happen, it seems unscientific, it's not generally how the world works. But if you suggest how that works, and if you apply your effect so that metaphorically that's the implication of them, you don't explicitly say to them, This is a connection between people. We have linked you in some sort of way. We have specifically picked a couple because a couple have a natural sense of intuition between the two of them. If you say that to them, you've lost them. But if you just get a couple up and then suggest that to them, and that suggestion can be through metaphorical language, it can be through explaining something that's happened to you. And I think that's another important point with scripting. If you're going to connect with your audience, they need to know a little bit about you, and you need to know a little bit about them. So if, for example, you're performing something like an ambitious card routine, and your logical premise there is pretty much going to have to be that you're a sleight of hand artist. So rather than explicitly saying that, you might start off in your first bit of your routine by saying, when I was younger, I used to practice sleight of hand. That's all the suggestion you need. That is literally enough to get people saying, well, that could have been sleight of hand if they're skeptic. But then start talking about the difficulties you have. Start saying stuff like, well, I used to find that when I first started to perform sleight of hand, my hands were too small. I couldn't handle the cards, kept dropping them all over the place. I was absolutely terrible about it. And don't underestimate the intelligence of your audience. You don't have to, for example, in this script that I'm mentioning, the ambitious card is a metaphor for overcoming problems. So I have now mentioned a problem, which means that I've now got to fix the problem and attribute this to the magical act of the card coming to the top. So now, rather than saying, but eventually if you try your best you always come to the top, which is kind of patronizing for the audience, I don't say anything. I mention a problem and I remain completely silent, and bearing in mind, as I'm talking about the problems, as I'm talking about getting a little bit lost in things sometimes, I just push the card into the deck, allow it to become its own metaphor, so that when I leave it silent and then turn it over, the problem resolves itself. So then in the next step, I want to cause a connection to them. So now at that point, I might say to them, so have you ever had a dream, an ambition, something that you wanted to achieve, but that you've kept having problems along the way? And then they might tell you, and then you start talking about, well, what sorts of problems have you encountered? And when they're talking about the problems, that's when you use your symbolism of putting the card back into the deck, and then you say, fantastic. You direct their attention back down again, don't say a word. Just leave it, and then pop it right back up to the top of the deck. So then at the end of your routine, you want to bring all that to a close. You want to give them this message that you've kept a big pause going on in between. And this can be something, I tend to say, if you're going to make a card pop to the top of the deck twice, to make it happen a third time, you won't fool them with it a third time. So generally you might want to do something like card to pocket, card to shoe, something like that. If you were going to do a card to pocket, I would suggest that you follow the same sort of narrative. I'd suggest that you start saying to them, so in your life you're going to start to have little issues, you're going to have little bits of problems and stuff, things that get in the way, you're not always going to be able to accomplish the things that you want. Pop the card into the back of the deck. And then you leave it a little while, turn the card over. Obviously at this point you want it to be the wrong card. This adds drama to the routine. This is that I was talking about where they're now thinking, well, it hasn't worked. So now you can go into some other sort of scripting and you can say, but the thing is, no matter how bad things look, no matter how complicated things get, and then you pull the card out of their pocket and you say you'll always be able to find your way. And it adds that metaphorical significance to them, because you've been, along the way, you've been resolving problems, one time after another. You've been showing them problems can always be resolved. So at the extent where even when it's failed at the end, you've still pulled that back. You've still pulled it back and you've still done an effect that is fantastic. So that sort of metaphorical language and them things, they run throughout every single performance that I've ever done. The reason that I perform like that is because your reactions are so much better. When you start actually attributing phenomena to just things that people can understand and that people can relate to, that in itself gets huge reactions. Just the fact that if you're talking about intuition, and you start talking about when you've been thinking about someone and then they've rang you on the phone, the amount of times that gets people invested, because everybody's done it. Or you can say to someone, if you were doing a paranormal thing, for example, if you wanted to perform some sort of ghostly effect for Halloween or something like that, you could start talking about, have you ever had one of those moments in your house where you've felt a sort of chill and then something's fell over? Obviously it's a draft, but you don't mention to them that it's a draft, because most people have felt that sort of thing at some point. Most people have had something fall off the mantelpiece or something. You can make it relatable to them. The idea that you seem to know what's happened within their life, and then asking for their stories. And on top of that, when people start giving you their stories in situations like that, don't cut them short. I tend to think that the most enjoyable thing you can do with a participant is often to just speak to them. So if I'm talking to a participant about, for example, they wanted to become an astronaut, and I sit there and start saying, well, why couldn't you become an astronaut? And they start telling me about all different reasons that they couldn't become an astronaut. I don't at any point cut them short. I will sit there and quite happily listen to everything they've got to say. Because in their head, that must be enjoyable. If it weren't enjoyable, they'd have stopped a long time ago. So you're still entertaining them just in allowing them to speak. So a lot of the time, just having a conversation with the audience like that, on top of building fantastic rapport, it goes away with everybody being entertained. Because at the end of the day, who doesn't like talking? Everybody likes speaking. Everybody likes speaking about their own life in some way. So when you ask about things like that, just allow them to go on as much as they want. Obviously, that only applies to close-up. When you're on stage, you do have a fixed agenda. When you're on stage, you've got to perform a certain number of effects. So in a stage environment, you do have to sort of teeter your audience management more towards sort of speeding them up a little bit, just for the sake of fitting everything in before the end. In close-up, you're really not limited to that sort of thing. You can sit there and just talk to the audience and then go and move on to somebody else. They don't mind. As long as you've entertained everyone in a close-up show, that's all that really matters.
All right, man. Well, we're actually right up at our hour and a half. That was heavily informative. Thank you very much for the free lecture.
I will mention, as a final thing, I don't know if you can hear me all right after the cameras.
Oh, I'm sorry. Was that you?
Yeah, you went a bit.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, no, I was. I apologize. I had muted myself during the lecture so that you could go ahead and do your thing. I apologize. Go on.
I will mention as a final sort of thing. Again, the offer that I mentioned towards the beginning with scripting and that sort of thing. Obviously, I'd like everybody who watches to sort of take into consideration the things that I've mentioned during this, and to try their best at creating their own scripts. But if you're a little bit underconfident with it, if you'd like to send me your scripts through and get me to have a look at the script, get me to help you with improving them script, then completely feel free to message me with them. I don't mind that at all. We were also talking about the possibility of potentially doing some sort of offer. So I will say that I will do a... Shall we do a competition? Yeah, a competition sounds good. Do you want people to message you, or do you want them to message me?
They can message you directly if you're willing to take in those messages. Actually, do what? No. For contests and competitions, there is his proper email, and I believe it's competitions@fullcirclemagic.com. Edward, if you're still watching, if you could go ahead and put that link in below. Otherwise, I will go ahead and do it as soon as the lecture is over.
Okay. So, what's the normal process for competitions on FCM? Do we have to ask a question, or do we run it more like BIMP, where we just ask them to message in and...
Well, that is entirely up to you. I generally do the message in if we don't have any ideas. But considering we want to do the giveaway kind of a what's the prize? I'm sorry.
The prize I will give whoever wins a copy of Eidetic, and this will be the sort of newer version of Eidetic, the one that's fully adapted. And I will also send over a full copy of the script for Eidetic, which I haven't actually done before. So yeah, shall we? We'll
Okay,
say,
so one more time.
shall we say the fifth person to message you with a particular word
Okay, that's fine.
gets the prize?
Let's do that. What
Yeah,
word? Like,
the word, I think we should pick scripting.
scripting. All right. So
Yeah.
fifth message on scripting, and you get a free copy of Eidetic with the script. So that's
Yeah.
the big thing there. In that case, that's the competition, guys. I will leave the link in the description below, and start messaging me as soon as I put that link up. Besides that, Oliver, I want to thank you very much for coming and sharing all this time with us. You've been awesome. Thank you very much, sir.
Yeah, it's been absolutely
Uh,
fantastic to talk with you and to be able to share my thoughts with the people on FCM as well. Obviously, I appreciate the opportunity to share my thoughts and ideas with the rest of the people in the Magic community. So, thank you, people who are watching.
And believe me, we all really appreciate it, man. I also want to make sure to thank Edward. Make sure to thank Edward for, of course, running the site and making all this possible. I believe Laura's the one who put this one together. A quick shout out to her. And besides that, thank you for spending your time with us. Um, and I think that concludes our broadcast today. Sound good?
Yep, that sounds fantastic.
All right. Thank you very much, man. We'll talk to you in a little while.
Thank you very much. Bye bye.